The low winter sun bled thin light across the sterile white sheets of Vivian's hospice bed. She looked impossibly small, a skeleton draped in the silk of a terminal illness. Yet her eyes, sharp, sapphire blue, held the familiar glint of a predator cornering its prey. It was Christmas Eve, and she was dying faster than the doctors had predicted, her lungs choked by the same smoke that haunted the remote Montana ranch where we grew up. The family's ancestral property, the Bar M, lay silent beneath a fresh coat of freezing rain outside Missoula, its deep pine forests smelling of damp earth and coming death. Vivian shifted, forcing a cough that rattled the oxygen monitor beside her, and then issued the cruel, impossible challenge. "I know what you think of me, Ilara, that I'm weak, afraid of the end. But you are worse," Vivian whispered, the sound thin as ice. "Your flaw is not malice. It is pure, poisonous stoicism." My hands, which were resting neatly in my lap, stiffened. Vivian had always known how to peel back my skin and expose the tightly locked muscles beneath. I believed emotion was incompetence. Vulnerability was surrender. I had spent my entire life perfecting the art of presenting an impenetrable fortress, especially against the chaos Vivian generated. I bet you the ranch, the Bar M, clear and unencumbered, that you cannot last. You cannot manage to hide your genuine pain, not once, related to my death or anything else, until the very moment the lawyer reads my will. The choice was instantaneous, brutal. To refuse was to admit cowardice, to confirm her final devastating diagnosis of my character. To accept meant burying the grief that was already tightening my chest into an iron fist, knowing that the slightest slip, a single tear, a moment of unguarded truth, would cost me the only place I ever felt anchored. I hated her, but I loved that ranch more, and more importantly, I hated losing. "Done," I managed, my voice steady, betraying nothing of the deep tremor that ran through my abdomen. 6 months, Viv, or until the will reading. The sound of the monitor's steady beep, beep, beep was the metronome of our ticking clock. I had to maintain the mask until her death triggered the final performance. Vivian's lips curled into a phantom smile, the last act of a lifetime spent engineering emotional traps for me. We were 2 scorpions in a bottle, and now the bottle was shrinking. Vivian didn't even grant me the full 6 months. 3 days after the agreement, the frantic, flatlining whine of the monitor shattered the hospice quiet. Ilara stood by the window, watching the freezing rain turn to sleet over the vast white fields bordering the city, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Dr. Alistair, a weary man whose suit smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee, approached her desk later that afternoon, clutching Vivian's final chart. "Ms. Thorne," he started, his voice a low rumble of disapproval. "I have to admit your reaction, or lack thereof, concerns me." Ilara lifted a precise eyebrow, signing the last necessary form, the request for a simple cremation. "Concerned about my efficiency, Doctor? I assure you, everything is handled. I've already contacted the lawyer regarding the will reading a setup." She didn't look up, focusing instead on the fine print, the faint scratching of her pen the only sound in the small office. The surface of the cheap particle board desk felt cool and slightly sticky beneath her forearm. Dr. Alistair placed a heavy hand on the desk, forcing her attention. "I understand the need for strength, but she was your sister. I watched you administer her medication yesterday, emotionless. I watched you confirm her passing today, devoid of sorrow. This level of control, Ilara, is unhealthy. It builds walls, not foundations. Walls are necessary in Montana, Doctor. They keep the wolves out." Ilara's chin tilted slightly. Her control was perfect, but the doctor's invasive gaze felt like sandpaper against her skin. This was the immediate minor consequence of her stoicism, alienating the people who might offer genuine support, confirming their suspicion that she was a machine. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see the crack. She gave him only granite. The truth was, every signature, every official phone call, was a punch to her solar plexus, but she allowed no outward sign of the accumulating bruises. She had to protect the Bar M. She remembered the sheer glee in Vivian's eyes, a mirror reflecting Ilara's own stubborn refusal to yield, and knew the stakes were far higher than mere property. The will stipulates a mandatory 30-day processing period before the formal reading, Dr. Alastair informed her, his expression hardening. A month. I suggest, Ms. Thorne, you use that time to feel something, anything. He turned sharply and left, the soft thud of the closing door echoing in the silence. 30 days. The first segment of the moire clock had begun. Back at the bar M, Alara immersed herself in the brutal competence of ranch management. The air inside the main cabin smelled faintly of old leather and wood smoke, a scent that was both comforting and sharp with memory. She needed the physical exhaustion to suppress the emotional noise. The first challenge arrived when the main water pump, vital for the remaining cattle in the deep Montana winter, sputtered and died. This was Obstacle 1, a pure challenge of practical competence, designed to test her focus under stress. The ground was frozen solid, requiring specialized equipment to dig down to the fractured pipe. Alara spent 12 hours straight in the sub-zero cold, her breath crystallizing in the flashlight beam. She called the neighboring rancher, Silas, an elderly man who was skeptical of Alara's ability to run the bar M without Vivian's erratic but forceful presence. You should have hired a crew, Alara, Silas grumbled over the roar of the diesel generator he lent her, the rough texture of his canvas jacket brushing her arm as he pointed out the leak. Hiring is expensive, Silas. I fix what breaks. Her jaw was clenched, the effort of manipulating the heavy iron wrench making the muscles in her neck stand out like cords. The sheer physicality was a defense mechanism. She could feel the penetrating cold sinking into the thick wool of her gloves, but the pain in her knuckles was a welcome distraction from the hollow ache in her chest. Every successful turn of the wrench, every spark from the welding torch, was a silent, desperate scream that she was worthy of the land, that Vivian's final trap wouldn't work. She worked through the night, the only sound the rhythmic clang of metal against metal, punctuated by the high-pitched whine of the wind whipping down from the Rocky Mountain peaks. By dawn, the pipe was patched, and the pump was roaring back to life, sending a rush of clear, cold water back to the troughs. Silas nodded once, a grudging admission of her skill, before driving off. Alara stood in the snow, exhausted, but victorious over the pump. The practical challenge was overcome. She had proven her competence. But as she walked back toward the silent cabin, she caught sight of the old swing set near the barn, half buried in the snow. Vivian had painted the swings fiery red when they were teenagers, insisting they needed flair in the oppressive quiet of the valley. A sudden sharp image of Vivian, laughing, her hair catching the sun, punched her in the throat. Alara pressed her gloved hands over her mouth, stifling a gasp that felt dangerously close to a sob. 28 days until the Mar. You're reading Arasor. The smallest sign of weakness would cost her everything. She turned away quickly, kicking snow over the vision, her face rigid. The mask held. The following week brought relentless, icy weather, mirroring the atmosphere inside the bar M. Alara found a thick, sealed ledger hidden beneath Vivian's old jewelry box, bound in faded crimson leather. It wasn't a diary, but a precise, financial record of every transaction and debt related to the ranch. A secret history Alara had never been privy to, as Vivian had always managed the accounts. The ink smelled faintly of lavender, Vivian's signature scent. The ledger revealed the true desperation of their situation. The ranch was deeply leveraged, not just against the bank, but against a shadowy consortium in Billings, an organization known for aggressively seizing property. Vivian, in her typical explosive fashion, had taken out a high-interest short-term loan 5 years prior, collateralized entirely by the deed. The note was due in 30 days, precisely the day of the will reading. Alara slammed the book shut, the hollow thud echoing in the cavernous living room. This wasn't just a challenge of competence. It was sabotage. Vivian hadn't just created an emotional test. She'd created a guaranteed financial collapse if Alara failed the emotional one. If Alara lost the bet, she lost the ranch twice, once to the will, and once to the debt collectors. The irony was scalding. Vivian knew the only thing that could force Alara to show feeling was the threat of losing the land. Yet Vivian had ensured the land was almost lost anyway. Alara began working furiously to consolidate the debt. Her hands flew across her laptop keyboard, contacting every bank she knew, every friend her parents had trusted, describing the assets, the prize-winning cattle, the 1,000 acres of prime Montana forest, all while meticulously omitting any mention of the precarious deadline or the bet. She maintained a professional, utterly neutral tone on every call, even when facing dismissal and polite refusal. Her voice was level, her logic irrefutable. The stress was a physical presence. She stopped eating proper meals, surviving on black coffee and stale biscuits. She found herself subconsciously twisting the gold ring on her right middle finger, a ring Vivian had given her years ago, carved with a small, stylized mountain peak. The ring's cool, smooth metal was a tiny focus point, grounding her. But one night, searching through old documents in the basement, she caught a whiff of something metallic and sharp. Blood. She had twisted the ring so violently, so continuously, that the skin beneath it had been rubbed raw. A small, perfect circle of dark, dried blood stained her finger. She had been bleeding for hours without noticing. She grabbed a tissue, cleaned it, and returned to the spreadsheets. Her control absolute, yet the damage was mounting beneath the surface. 20 days left. Alara's last hope for securing a quick loan lay with the Thorne family's longtime attorney, Mr. Graves. When she presented the ledger and the due date, his face turned the color of ash. He confirmed that the loan structure was predatory and designed to fail. Graves then delivered obstacle 2, the dilemma, moral, and reversion 1. There is one option, Alara. A loophole, Graves said, lowering his voice, which smelled of old leather and mints. Vivian had a valuable personal asset, a portfolio of early-stage tech stocks that are currently spiking. It's worth enough to clear the debt and secure the Bar M. He placed a single, crisp document on his mahogany desk. But that portfolio is not part of the ranch assets. It's listed separately in the will, bequeathed entirely to the hospice, Dr. Alistair's program. The air in the office suddenly felt too thick to breathe. The cold, polished surface of the desk reflected Alara's rigid expression. To save the Bar M, she had to deny the money to the very place that had offered her sister comfort in her final days, effectively stealing aid from the sick. It was a direct moral sacrifice. Her stoicism urged her to choose the rational asset, the ranch, over sentimental attachments to charity. Vivian had always believed Alara was incapable of prioritizing anything over her own self-interest and control. This choice was designed to prove it. Vivian put the portfolio into escrow, to be released only upon the formal will reading, Graves continued, tapping the document. However, the legal language permits a preemptive claim. If the executor demonstrates dire financial hardship that directly threatens the stability of a primary estate asset, you can leverage the debt to claim the portfolio now, but it would be seen as a deeply cynical move. Alara picked up the pen. The soft scratch of the nib against the thick paper was deafening. She thought of the ranch, the vast, echoing silence of the Montana plains, the place where she finally felt safe. She thought of Vivian, staring her down on her deathbed. The ranch was the prize, the test, the proof. Draft the claim, Alara ordered, her voice flat, devoid of inflection. She had made the immoral choice, sacrificing benevolence for security. Reversion 1. What Alara believed, that the bet was purely emotional, was wrong. The bet was a complex financial trap designed to force her into moral compromise, proving her coldness even if she won the land. The realization that Vivian had orchestrated the ranch's financial distress, specifically to test her ethical limits, not just her emotional ones, made her stomach clench into a knot of cold fury. 10 days left. The money would solve the debt, but the cost of the victory was already rising. The moral sacrifice haunted the Bar M cabin. Alara had secured the financial solvency, but the silence of the house was now louder, heavier. She kept expecting to hear the phantom ring of the phone, someone condemning her decision to divert the hospice funds. Dr. Alistair, the weary doctor, called 2 days later, not to condemn, but to ask a simple logistical question about Vivian's medical records. He mentioned the portfolio sale only once, without judgment. That fund was earmarked for our palliative care wing, Ms. Thorne. A shame, but I understand tough choices must be made to save legacy assets. The doctor's mild disappointment was far more effective than any fiery accusation. It made the bitter taste of her rational choice stick to the back of her throat. Alara found herself spending hours cleaning out Vivian's bedroom, an act she had previously delayed. Vivian's side of the closet still smelled faintly of cheap perfume and stale cigarettes, a noxious mix that triggered a sudden, vivid memory of their teenage years, fighting over a borrowed dress. Ilara was meticulous, folding sweaters into perfect rectangles, her movements stiff and controlled. She uncovered a small wooden box tucked beneath the floorboards, its surface rough and worn. Inside, there was a stack of letters addressed to Ilara, none of them ever sent. The first letter, dated 10 years prior, was short, a frantic apology for some forgotten petty cruelty. The last, written in a shaky hand barely a week before her death, mentioned the ranch, but not the bet. The last letter read, "Ilara, the air is thin up here in Montana. Now, it always was. I know you hate my chaos, but you built a better wall than I built chaos. I need you to know, the Bar M is yours. Don't let me destroy it, or you. I'm trying to leave something good behind. Trust graves. Trust the land." Ilara reread the last phrase, her eyes burning but dry. Trust graves. Trust the land. This suggested Vivian had intended for Ilara to secure the ranch, not necessarily that she intended for Ilara to choose the cynical path. The letter offered a fleeting moment of connection, a crack in the granite wall, a suggestion that perhaps Vivian's intentions weren't purely malicious. Ilara's breathing hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor running through her shoulders. She forced her body straight, replacing the letters and locking the box. She hadn't cried. The stoicism held. 5 days until the will reading. The pressure was almost unbearable. The final days were a relentless tightening spiral. Ilara had overcome the practical failure, the pump, and survived the moral dilemma, the hospice funds. She had nearly won. But the inherent flaw of her stoicism was that it required suppressing not just sorrow, but also the instinct for connection and genuine self-protection. It blinded her to complex human motivations beyond the transactional. Obstacle 3, the crisis maximum, arrived 24 hours before the spawns. Reading. Silas, the neighboring rancher, drove up the long gravel driveway in his rusty pickup. He stepped out, his face etched with something deeper than his usual grudging approval. "Ilara, I need to show you something," he said, handing her a newspaper clipping. It was an obituary, but not Vivian's. It was the obituary of an old school friend, Maria, who had died 6 months ago after a brief, violent struggle with brain cancer. The fine print mentioned that Maria's teenage daughter was left without immediate family and, crucially, without funds. Vivian put the Bar M in a legal trust right after Maria died, Silas explained, his voice low, smelling faintly of diesel and tobacco. "She didn't own the ranch free and clear to bet it against you, Ilara. Not entirely. The trust stipulated that if Maria's daughter, Chloe, had nowhere else to go, she inherited a 49% stake in the Bar M and the right to live there immediately." The sheer shock made Ilara's vision tunnel. Vivian hadn't just created a financial trap. She had used the land as a last resort shelter, hedging her own life against the fate of an orphaned girl. Silas looked down at the icy ground. Vivian changed the trust 3 weeks ago. She called Graves and instructed him to remove the clause about Chloe. She canceled Chloe's inheritance. Ilara's breath hitched in her throat. "Why?" "Because of you," Silas whispered. "Vivian told me you'd never forgive her if the ranch was split, and she knew you'd hate the obligation of a kid. She said you'd sell the whole thing out of spite if the inheritance wasn't 100% clean. This was the maximum loss, directly caused by her flaw. Vivian, fearing Ilara's relentless, unfeeling competence, her stoicism, had sacrificed a vulnerable, orphaned girl's security just to ensure Ilara got the unencumbered prize she craved. Vivian hadn't just tested Ilara. She had fundamentally misunderstood Ilara's capacity for love beneath the mask, believing her sister was truly that cold. The cost of winning the bet meant causing real, tangible harm to an innocent person, based on a lie. Ilara doubled over. The air punched out of her lungs, not from grief over Vivian, but from the horrifying realization of the collateral damage caused by her own refusal to show vulnerability. Ilara spent the night pacing the length of the long, cold living room of the Bar M. The heavy silence was broken only by the creak of the old floorboards under her boots. Silas's words, "She canceled Chloe's inheritance because of you," played on an endless loop. Her pursuit of the ranch, her relentless, toxic stoicism, had convinced Vivian that her sister was utterly heartless. The bet hadn't been about winning the ranch. It had been about forcing Alara to feel. But when Vivian realized Alara's defenses were too strong, she prioritized ensuring Alara got the whole prize, inadvertently punishing a child in the process. This was the night dark of the soul. Alara saw her own reflection in the dim window, a woman perfectly composed, standing alone in a vast, empty house in the middle of frozen Montana, entirely defined by her refusal to hurt. But the refusal to hurt was merely the flip side of the refusal to connect. She had protected herself from pain so thoroughly that she had inadvertently caused catastrophic pain to others, starting with Vivian's final assessment of her character. Alara moved to the fireplace, reaching out to the heavy mantelpiece, the wood rough beneath her fingertips. She remembered Chloe, a shy, skinny girl who used to visit the ranch with Maria in the summers, whose quiet laughter mingled with Vivian's loud, boisterous sound. Alara had always dismissed her as Vivian's latest stray, another distraction. Now, the weight of the girl's loss was heavier than the massive debt she had just cleared. The decision crystallized with sudden, painful clarity. Her flaw had cost her connection and morality. Now she had to choose vulnerability, the very thing she had sworn off, to repair the damage. She grabbed the phone, her hands shaking so violently she had to brace her wrist against the wooden mantel to dial. She called Mr. Graves's emergency line. The lawyer answered, his voice groggy. Graves. Alara's voice was low, taut, with suppressed emotion, but entirely real. I need you to prepare 2 documents immediately. First, a revocation of my claim on the hospice funds. I want that money back in the palliative care account before the reading. Second, I need a notarized letter confirming that I am immediately relinquishing 49% of my inherited share of the Bar M. It goes to Chloe. Graves was silent for a long moment. Alara, if you relinquish 49% now, you could lose the entire ranch if you lose the bet. You could be left with nothing. I know, she said, her voice breaking slightly on the last word, the first honest sign of distress, of sacrifice, she had allowed in months. The crack had appeared. She had changed. She had prioritized genuine, costly human obligation over her flawless control, and the prize. This hot will reading is at 9 a.m. The lawyer's office in downtown Missoula smelled of expensive paper and stale coffee grounds. Alara sat perfectly straight on the antique wooden chair, her outward appearance a masterpiece of composure. Graves adjusted his spectacles. Dr. Allister sat beside him, looking curious, and Silas stood near the door, a worried frown pulling at his mouth. Alara felt the scratchy texture of the tweed jacket she wore. It was Vivian's, something she'd found and put on almost unconsciously this morning. Graves began reading the final testament, his voice slow and deliberate. He covered the expected items, the cremation requests, the few small personal bequests, and the statement of the will-reading bet. In regards to the Bar M Ranch, Graves read, I, Vivian Thorne, bequeath it entirely to my sister, Alara Thorne, under the explicit condition that she has adhered to the terms of our agreement, that she show no overt, genuine emotional pain or distress related to my death, or any immediate financial or personal crisis stemming from my estate, until this moment. Graves paused, looking directly at Alara. The fire clock had stopped. Alara, he asked, the final, terrifying question hanging in the quiet room. Did you break the agreement? Alara took a deep, steady breath. She thought of the fear, the isolation, the sheer grind of the last 30 days, and the excruciating, painful realization of the damage her mask had caused. She hadn't cried over Vivian, but she had cried over Chloe, over the loss of her own humanity. She chose the truth, knowing it meant losing the ranch and possibly being left penniless due to the debt she had temporarily cleared. Her throat tightened, but she forced the words out, choosing honesty over her lifelong dedication to self-control. Yes, Alara said, the word barely a whisper, yet it crashed through the silence. I broke the agreement. Yesterday, I felt genuine, profound pain when I realized what my actions, my perceived coldness, had cost Chloe, Maria's daughter. I called you, Graves, and instructed you to return the funds to the hospice and to transfer a 49% share of the Bar M to Chloe, regardless of this reading. The pain of the moral failure, the pain of knowing I hurt an innocent girl, broke my control. Dr. Allister's eyes widened. and Silas let out a quiet, relieved exhale. Alara leaned forward, ready for the financial ruin and the total, crushing loss of the land. "In that case, Miss Thorne," Graves said, reaching under the desk for a second sealed envelope, "your sister anticipated this, or at least prayed for it." Reversion 2-1. Graves carefully broke the seal on the second envelope, the dry sound of tearing paper unnerving in the quiet room. This document was not notarized. It was a simple, handwritten letter from Vivian, dated the day before her death. The ink smelled faintly of lavender and something metallic, perhaps the rustling of a deathbed confession. Graves began to read. "If Alara stands here, having maintained her perfect, poisonous stoicism until the final word, then she wins the ranch, and she deserves the empty acres. If she has won the financial battles but has confessed to breaking the emotional promise, if she has admitted genuine selfless pain, prioritizing something over the prize, then she has already won the real bet." The lawyer paused, adjusting his tie. "This letter amends the will, overriding the initial condition. It states, if Alara confesses to breaking the agreement due to emotional, moral compulsion, she receives 100% of the Bar M and immediately assumes ownership of the full, unencumbered estate, minus the previously claimed hospice funds, which are to be permanently returned by the estate." Reversion 2. The final revelation was that the bet was never about forcing Alara to grieve Vivian. It was about forcing Alara to admit to caring about someone else more than her own victory or control. Vivian had set up the financial crisis and the Chloe dilemma specifically, knowing that losing the Bar M might finally be the price Alara was willing to pay to save her own soul. Vivian's ultimate victory was Alara's admission of vulnerability. The shock left Alara physically cold, despite the warmth of the room. She hadn't lost the ranch. She had won it, but only by choosing to lose it. Dr. Allister smiled, a genuine, warm expression that finally erased his weariness. "The hospice funds are being transferred back as we speak, Ms. Thorne. Thank you." Silas clapped his large, gloved hand on Alara's shoulder. "She was proud of you, Alara. She knew you had a heart. She just had to dig down to Montana bedrock to find it." Alara finally looked down at her hands, the gold ring still biting into the raw skin of her finger. She had won the ranch, secured Chloe's 49% share by her own choice, which the estate would now honor, and cleared the debt. But the victory was entirely submerged in the devastating realization that Vivian had engineered every moment, manipulating her own death to force Alara to become a better feeling person. Alara lifted her head, her eyes clear, but the faint, internal tremor was visible now in the slight, downward pull of her lips. She had lost her sister, and she had lost her lifelong fortress of emotion. That rigid, invincible woman was gone forever. The cost of victory was permanent transformation, and the crushing truth that her sister's last act was not a trap, but a desperate, elaborate rescue mission.